much. So thank you all for attending, either synchronously or asynchronously. This is a great opportunity to hear about some really interesting research going on in the community. So thank you also to Michael for the invite and for managing all of this. As Michael said, my name is Sean Tallman, and I am a forensic anthropologist and professor, assistant professor at Boston University, where I teach and research in the Masters of Science program in forensic anthropology, and I lead the Forensic and Bioanthropology Laboratory, or Fab Lab group. So you can email me at any time if you have questions, or you can find me on Twitter at FabLabBU. Yeah, so thank you again for being here. Today I'm going to talk to you obviously about diversity and inclusion in forensic anthropology, but also give you a brief introduction about what forensic anthropology is and my experience with forensic anthropology, and then get into the diversity and inclusion aspect. So just a heads up or a little warning before moving forward, there are some human remains that are featured throughout the presentation in skeletal form, though they are minimal and not particularly graphic. So just to give you a very brief introduction of myself, I am a biological anthropologist who specializes in forensic anthropology, human skeletal biology, and forensic archaeology. So I'm a broadly trained four-field anthropologist that has received anthropology degrees at all levels. So I am from Seattle, Washington, and currently living in Boston. And I got my PhD at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. Now, in between my master's and my PhD, I worked for several years as a forensic anthropologist through the Department of Defense's Central Identification Laboratory, which is now managed by the Defense POW Accounting Agency, or DPAA, a lot of acronyms in the government. But I'll be speaking towards that in a second. And then I, again, am presently an assistant professor in the Departments of Anatomy and Neurobiology at BU, and also in anthropology. I'm a forensic anthropologist with the Disaster Mortuary Operational Response Team, which is a federal list and response agency that can respond to mass disasters across the US. I also still do occasional archaeology, forensic archaeology work with the DPAA as an archaeologist. And then of particular interest for this talk also, I'm the co-chair of the Committee on Diversity and Inclusion through the American Academy of Forensic Sciences Anthropology section, and then was just recently named chair of the Diversity Outreach Committee for the AAFS as well. So I will be talking about that as well. So just to give you a really brief introduction of what forensic or anthropology is in general, I'm sure many of you are somewhat familiar with anthropology. But it's a really broad discipline, right? So it's basically just the study of humans. But we divide it up, at least in the States, with four big, broad units. But we have cultural anthropology, linguistic anthropology, archaeology, which forensic archaeology falls under. And then we have biological anthropology that used to be referred to as physical anthropology. So Michael Rivera did a great talk on this a few days ago about the current and past and future of biological anthropology. So please see his talk for more information. So obviously these four categories are very broad. And I fall within the archaeology and biological anthropology aspect, as does sort of forensic anthropology in general. And so forensic anthropology then relies basically on human osteology, or human skeletal biology. And it has been sort of historically viewed as an application of biological anthropology methods and theory in order to answer medical legal questions. So that definition has been sort of changing recently, but it is still that fundamental definition. And so forensic anthropology, compared to other scientific disciplines, is actually a relatively new discipline. It was formed officially through the American Academy of Forensic Sciences in 1972, though there were practitioners before that. In fact, the earliest case happened in Boston in the late 1800s at Harvard. But early on, there were actually no official training programs like I teach at now. So it was all very anatomy-based and anthropology-based. So early on, the definition of forensic anthropology really stressed the application of the physical portion of anthropology. So that is like the human skeleton, to the legal process for the purpose of identification. And of course, that's still important, but they wanted to know in particular who the person was as represented by the bones. So really this early operational part of forensic anthropology really stressed the osteology and got into the biological profile, which I'll get into in a second, and strove for identification. The field was also really, I would say, obsessed with really determining the differences between quote unquote Black and white groups, and then also a little bit later on Asian groups. But in the States, the Asian groups that were often included in analyses were really Native American derived from archaeological sites. And so that's been an area of interest and research for me. These earlier methods and earlier forensic anthropologists really relied on some qualitative methods that lacked sort of statistical validation and scientific basis. And it was really a laboratory-based science wherein the practitioners would wait for remains to be brought to them, and they would do the analysis and send the remains back. They weren't really in the field very much. And it was also a very just typological approach, wherein again, we're looking at distinct differences between groups in order to differentiate individuals that can hopefully help us make an identification. Now, things like the advent of DNA and legal rulings have really influenced the change of the field for the better, in that it's really gotten to be a much more scientifically oriented field. So today, one of a modern working definition of forensic anthropology is the scientific discipline that focuses on the life, the death, and the post-life of a specific individual as reflected primarily in their skeletal remains and the physical and forensic context in which they are placed. So essentially, we're interested in who the person was during life, what happened at or around the time of death, and then what has happened to the body post-death, and primarily reflected in the skeleton, though we can look at other soft tissue and other material evidence as well. So forensic anthropologists, hopefully, are anthropologists first, so we should be broadly trained as anthropologists. We, of course, are still interested in the human skeleton and still interested in the biological profile, which I'll explain in a second. But we are really developing new quantified methods and statistics based on new expanded collections. And that we're actually even using things like CT scans now to collect modern demographics, demographic information that really reflect the modern demographics of, say, somewhere like the US or other worldwide locations. We're applying theories and methods from other fields like taphonomy. Taphonomy is just a fancy word for the study of what happens to the body after death. Of course, we're developing new methods and theories in forensic archaeology. We're adopting things like stable isotopes to estimate where a person might have been born or lived for a portion of their life. And then we're adopting methods and theories from biomechanics to help us with fracture interpretation. So really, forensic anthropologists can get really specialized in their research. At the same time, we are quite holistic in that we should be broadly trained as well. So unfortunately, there aren't a lot of jobs in forensic anthropology, despite the prevalence of it in the media or on television shows. You might find forensic anthropologists at medical examiners or coroner offices around the country in the US, though that's particularly in large urban areas like New York City, but other locations have them as well. At universities like where I teach, perhaps at museums, in the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation, though there's only 2. You find them in international organizations doing humanitarian and human rights investigations. You'll find them in the Disaster Mortuary Operational Response Team, which I'm a part of. And one of the largest and sort of historically been really important employer of our field has been the Department of Defense, and in particular that Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency's Central Identification Laboratory, which is currently one of the world's largest forensic anthropology laboratories and where I worked for several years. So that laboratory has been historically important for a number of reasons, but it was started during World War II in response to the large numbers of deaths experienced by the US in both the European and Pacific theaters. And the lab was established on the island of Oahu in Hawaii. And it was basically a really large warehouse that you see on your left, wherein you had individuals laid out in anatomical position in almost a conveyor belt situation. And you had several morgue personnel and embalming technicians analyzing the remains. And then there'd be only one anthropologist who served as the scientific director and would actually make the identifications. So it was a very different approach. Things have changed much more lately into a much more scientific organization, but really the organization's goal is to recover and identify US service members killed during past conflicts, including World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam conflict. So with those three conflicts alone, there are over 84,000 missing service members. Now, roughly half of those are probably unrecoverable due to like water losses, but still roughly half of those are theoretically potentially recoverable. Other countries do have similar things, similar goals in their practice as well, like Canada, Australia, Japan. But this has been a really big concerted effort in the States. Today, the lab is, again, one of the largest forensic anthropology labs and employs a lot of people. So there are over 40 forensic anthropologists and forensic archaeologists who work there. In addition, there are forensic odontologists or forensic dentists, a lot of historians, archival staff, support staff. So it's a really large organization, all with the goal of recovering and identifying US war dead. Now, the anthropologists who work there are civilians, but it is couched within a military organization, a joint command between the Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marines. And so the anthropologists who go do the recoveries in the field work hand in hand with the military and work essentially on military teams, likely as the only civilian. So because the lab is focused on recovering and identifying US service members from past conflicts, at any one time throughout the year, except for right now, you'll find anthropologists working in like Europe or the South Pacific for World War II losses, Southeast Asia for Vietnam, and South Korea for the Korean War. But the lab has done recoveries in other locations like in India and Greenland and China, and really in many other locations like mainland US, in South America, Australia, Northern Africa, and in Hawaii. So all over. And of course, these locations aren't where we had battles, but it could be recoveries and identifications of service members who died during training or other operational losses. So it's not always in a quote unquote battlefield. But really, when I worked there, and I think still continuing, that almost 80% of the cases that we worked on were from Asian countries. So I spent a lot of time in Asia, particularly Laos and Vietnam. I've also done recoveries in Germany, in France, Solomon Islands, and in Papua New Guinea. But the majority of the work that was being done is in Asian countries. Now, when we are doing recoveries such as this, again, we are working with a military team, and we are oftentimes excavating aircraft crashes, either that were shot down or if there was mechanical error that otherwise brought down the aircraft. So when we go out into the field, we're not really trying to excavate the entire site and recover every bit of aircraft wreckage. We're not accident reconstructionists. We're trying to find evidence that will help us make identifications. So we're looking for very specific lines of evidence. In particular, we might be looking for like an impact crater where a plane has hit. We might be looking, if it's a large area, for some place like a cockpit or other duty locations where people were, or people should have been in theory. And then even we could be looking for things like metal concentrations. These sites have been altered significantly since World War II or since Vietnam, and they don't look like aircraft crash sites anymore. So we would use metal detectors and find metal concentrations. And really, we might even follow surface evidence as a proxy for what is potentially underneath. Obviously, that's an improper or sort of imprecise way to do it, but we have to start somewhere. And in particular, we're looking for osseous remains, so bone, and then things like material evidence. And we might be dropped off in a helicopter and picked up in 5 weeks. We could be dropped off every day, or we could be camping or staying at a hotel. So when we do go into the field, we are really just using archaeological methods and methods that you would see in a modern archaeological site or even a crime scene, an outdoor crime scene, but sort of on just a bigger scale. So we might be doing a pedestrian survey where we stand in a line and survey the surface for evidence. Once we've decided where to dig, we'd want to place an archaeological grid over the landscape, which basically is just like graph paper laid over the landscape. And then we would proceed to excavate in a controlled way where we excavate each one of those squares, grid squares, and keep the dirt and the evidence separate. And we're doing this primarily by hand with like trowels, shovels, pickaxes, all that stuff. But the type of location, the type of site and the location is going to dictate the methods that we're using. We may have to get a little bit more creative with our methods depending on the site. We might have a very deep excavation or that we would have to do. Say if a plane nosedived into very soft terrain like a rice paddy, that might create a very deep excavation. Of course, we'd have to then take safety into consideration. We might have to use mechanical equipment if it's over a really large area or if the site has been developed. We could have to use pumping or dredging equipment if the site is coastal and is inundated by the tide each day. And of course, we've done a lot of work in rice paddies, which is just mucky and difficult to work in general. So we often have to apply methods that we are kind of out of the box and creative. And so when we're looking for specific lines of evidence, and we do that in part by, of course, looking while we're digging, but because these sites are so old and because they have been so sort of altered through the landscape and development and just time, a lot of the evidence that we're finding is actually on the screen. So we want to take all that dirt that we dug from the archaeological area, dump it into a screen, sift that dirt, and look for anything that isn't natural. So anything that is metal or part of the aircraft, or of course bone or tooth. We can also use wet screening, so water we could pump in and spray over if we're on a coast. We can use that, and that really helps to clean up the material so we can really pop out and we can see a lot. Now, the evidence that we're looking for is very specific. So again, we aren't really interested in recovering every piece of aircraft wreckage or every piece of the battlefield, but we're interested in things like personal effects, and these can help us contribute indirectly to an identification. So this could be something like rank insignias or identification tags, even things like rings or watches. Those things could have like initials on them. We could also have things like prescription eyeglasses where we could take them to a optometrist locally and get a prescription. But then we're also looking for things like life support equipment. And what we call life support equipment is basically anything on the person that would help them sustain them in living out of the aircraft. So this could be things like the parachute itself, buckles that hold the parachute in place, survival knives. And if we're finding those in the ground and during the recovery, then those were close to the person and they could indicate the location of the body. So we'll follow that line of evidence. Now, not surprisingly, we're working in some really austere conditions because of the battles we fought. We're in very austere conditions. So this could be on mountaintops, steep rocky terrain. We could be base camping for weeks on end. We could be rappelling on mountainsides and doing underwater recoveries. I should note that this is not me rappelling, nor is it me going under the water, but we do have to work in some very austere locations. And when we are doing this, we are working hand in hand with the host nation. So they have invited the US in, we are representatives of the US, we're treating it as a humanitarian mission. And we work really closely with the individuals locally. We employ a lot of locals and we get to know them over the weeks that we're there. So we develop really close working relationships. And this is really exciting because it really engages all parts of my anthropology training, the cultural aspect because I'm usually abroad, linguistics because it's working in a different language. It could be, obviously we're using archaeology, and then of course the knowledge of biological anthropology and human osteology to be able to identify potential human remains as we're doing the excavation. So it's a really exciting aspect of this type of work. Now I bring up this fieldwork component quite a bit because it's really contributed to my training, and working at the DPAA was a formative training period for me. And when I was working there, I was working in the era prior to and then immediately following the abolition of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy in the US about gay and lesbian service members. So again, the the anthropologists are civilians, but we are working within the culture of a military organization. So that definitely impacts and creates a certain dynamic. And so, I was the first out gay forensic anthropologist doing recoveries like this for the organization. And that was curious to some people. A lot of my military team members found it interesting. Even some of the anthropologists, sort of camping and hiking and doing these sort of rugged activities is not sort of stereotypically associated with being gay. So that was an interesting experience working there at that time. And then to see the culture somewhat change a little bit after that abolition of the don't ask, don't tell policy. But it was during this time that I was really starting to think about issues related to diversity and inclusion, not only with the practitioners, but also the context in which we work, sometimes with the military and law enforcement. And then also in the collections we use for research. So after this, I pursued my PhD at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. So I went to the University of Tennessee because they have the Forensic Anthropology Center. And the Forensic Anthropology Center manages the Anthropological Research Facility. And many of you may be familiar with this as a body farm. This is, in fact, the first body farm. It was formed in the early 80s. And it was established in order to study human decomposition so that we can better estimate the postmortem interval, how long a person has been dead. So individuals donate their bodies. The remains are left on the ground surface or buried and decompose naturally, or we can recreate some crime scenes in order to investigate specific instances. Here I'm helping to train FBI evidence recovery technicians in how to locate and excavate and clandestine burial. So what is nice about this, in that it's fascinating research, obviously the decomposition component, but that basically all of the individuals who are decomposed through this facility are then retained by the university and curated in perpetuity so that the skeletons can be used for research forever, essentially, and so that we can continually refine our methods, and it represents modern individuals. Now, one of the issues with this is that the body donation program has many more European American individuals donating, so the demographics don't necessarily reflect the demographics of the US, so it does have some limitations, but overall it's a great resource for researchers. And so what we're doing then is when we do get the remains from an archaeological field setting, and then we bring them examine them in the laboratory, we are doing what's called the biological profile. So this is something that's been a part of our field for a long time and really been sort of the bread and butter of forensic anthropology. But essentially, forensic anthropologists, through measuring bone and looking at different morphologies, can estimate the biological sex, so that is male or female, not the gender. We can look at the age at death based on the overall development and overall morphological changes of joints. We can look at ancestry, so perhaps where the individual's ancestors might have originated, very broadly speaking. We can look at stature, so how tall the individual was during life. And then we can also look for things like pathologies, if there's any diseases on the remains. Diseases infrequently attack bone directly, but can leave some markers. And these might be documented in medical records and can help us make an identification. And then, of course, anthropologists are involved in trauma analysis. So we might be called to ask if there's any signs of blunt force trauma, sharp force trauma, gunshot wound trauma, or like explosive trauma. So understanding the biomechanics of bone and how it fractures is an important aspect. And then, of course, again, we're interested in the taphonomic history. That is what has happened to the remains after death. That could demonstrate that the remains have been moved into different burial environments or have been gnawed on by animals or altered. And we'd want to be able to say what has happened to those remains. Now, the biological profile in of itself is not going to help us make a positive identification. What this does is help us exclude and include individuals in order to more thoroughly and scientifically investigate who this person might be. So to get at a positive identification, we need to do this in a scientific way that typically compares antemortem or living data compared to postmortem or after death data. So this could be oftentimes in the dentition, so with the teeth themselves or with the fillings or restorations, comparing the morphology of them and location of them on the teeth. Those are very unique to individuals. We can also do this though through frontal sinuses. Frontal sinuses are air-filled chambers in your forehead between your eyes. These are present in most people and they're unique to individuals. And they're often captured in dental x-rays. So we can use the morphology of these in order to help make an identification. Of course, we have things like DNA and other identification means to pursue that as well. So, you know, I often get asked why we do this work, either through the DPAA or just forensic anthropology in general, and particularly within the US. And that's in that we do this basically for the living so that we can provide answers to living loved ones. So we're doing it for the living just as much as we're doing it for the dead, but we're helping to provide answers. I think there's some faulty or some misinformation out there that forensic practitioners bring closure to family members who are grieving loved ones. We are unable to bring closure. Closure is an ongoing psychological process that we can't bring, but that knowledge that we bring from investigations and from what happened to loved ones can help contribute to answers and contribute to the ongoing process. So that is something that is at least why I'm a part of it and what I find particularly interesting. So now shifting more towards diversity and inclusion. So again, in these contexts that I've been working throughout the years, I've been noticing the lack of diversity in practitioners, the lack of diversity sometimes in our research methods. And so it's gotten me thinking. So then as an individual, I sort of have been attacking diversity and inclusion in three major areas. So partly in research, so in basically moving beyond studying just African and European American individuals. Of course, in the States, those are the two largest demographics, so those are always going to be important in forensic research, but that obviously those are not the only two groups living in the States or other parts of the world. So we need to be able to develop methods that are applicable to other groups. And so I've been particularly interested in the skeletal biology and human variation in modern Asian populations, particularly Japan and Thailand. So through this, I've been able to participate in some symposia and some special journal editions, which has been great. Also, I've been involved in diversity and inclusion in some professional associations. So along with a colleague and I, which I'll speak about in a second, we've started surveying the state of diversity in forensic anthropology. And then I've also been serving as either a chair or a co-chair or a member of diversity-related committees within professional societies to explore diversity and inclusion initiatives. And then personally, as an educator, I've been trying to increase knowledge of and diversity and inclusion in general, you know, in part by actively advocating for diversity in admissions, particularly to graduate school where I teach, and encouraging diversity in student research, exploring new methods for research and new collections in which to collect data, and then also through things like mentoring. So it's not too surprising that anthropology is now in a self-reflective phase, and that biological anthropology and forensic anthropology in particular is in a self-reflective phase with diversity and inclusion. All sorts of organizations in science, government, academia, business have been reflecting on diversity and inclusion. So this is obviously nothing new or modern. But forensic anthropology has been particularly slow at addressing it. Susan Antone, a colleague in biological anthropology, has initiated this type of work years ago within the biological anthropology community. And she's identified a couple areas that have sort of prevented biological anthropologists from addressing diversity and inclusion. And this could be due in part to our racist and racialist past, in that the field of biological anthropology or the physical anthropology back in the day, like long time ago, was really focused on identifying differences in quote unquote racial groups and trying to rank groups based on their inferiority to essentially European males. And so not surprisingly, people of color have been reluctant to join the field of biological anthropology for those reasons. Also, because the field overall and practitioners and the societies that we're a part of have advocated against the biological race concept, rightfully, because it is not a biological reality. There's been sort of a collective fear of validating the biological race concept by actually investigating whether scholars from underrepresented communities are truly underrepresented in our field. That if we ask about it, it's going to sort of reinforce the biological race concept. So there's been this reluctance to do so. So forensic anthropology clearly shares these difficulties, but we also have a couple more impediments that I think are pretty unique. Overall, there's a lack of jobs in forensic anthropology compared to the people pursuing advanced degrees. It's actually unknown how many forensic practitioners there are in the States because of the tenuous profession and because there are, most of the jobs are part-time. And so that lack of jobs has really created an extremely competitive environment wherein there is not a lot of collaboration and there's sort of a lot of turf issues, historically speaking. And so that's really created a lot of competition. Also, as you can see with some of my work experience, where we're working might be embedded within some biased professional frameworks, either with law enforcement or military. And of course, these are changing and there's a lot of anti-discrimination and harassment things developing within all of these organizations. But organizational change is slow, and often as a forensic anthropologist, you're working alone within oftentimes a male-dominated field. Now, our field is overwhelmingly represented by women and females, but still they are potentially working within very male-dominated fields such as law enforcement and the military. And then lastly, we think that the issue of meritocracy, or basically promoting success and basing success and merit based on achievements that are designated achievements by a select few individuals and that aren't based on individuals' access to resources. We see that as a problem. That has basically promoted this paradox of meritocracy, where the individuals who are in charge believe themselves to be objective people who can assess who can and cannot do this work. And they aren't taking into account backgrounds or personal experiences that make it different for everybody to achieve these things. So this is problematic in our field, as it is in many different fields of science. So now, the American Academy of Forensic Sciences is, in the States, the largest forensic science academy. And it houses, right now, I think there are 7,000 individuals who are a part of it, and they're divided up into disciplines. So forensic anthropology has a discipline, or has a component of it, as does pathology and other forensic related fields. So diversity and inclusion and discrimination have been of interest to the American Academy of Forensic Sciences for some time, at least over the last decade, but change has been really slow to really address the issues. Now, in 2011, they put out a survey that was responded to by over 1,400 individuals. And they basically found no evidence for exclusion, bias, or prejudice throughout the academy. But really, the academy doesn't track demographics of its membership apart from age. So we really have no idea how homogenous or heterogeneous the academy truly is, but there's actually evidence to suggest that it's quite homogenous. So 12 to 14% of those responded in 2011 identified as a minority individual, and that is, the groups are listed there, but gender, race, color, Hispanic, Latino, creed, national origin, and sexual orientation. So pretty small. But what was interesting with this survey was that 83.8% thought that the AFS should not do more to increase minority applicants. And 85.9% thought that the AFS should not do more to increase minority participation in its activities. And perhaps more surprisingly, 90.7% thought that the AFS should not do more to recognize the achievements of its minority members. So overall, people just wanted to maintain the status quo. Now, the majority of individuals, like 97%, didn't find any evidence or report any evidence for discrimination or bias. But this is somewhat problematic. because the organization is homogenous. So the individuals who might be normal recipients of discriminatory behavior, underrepresented minorities, are not included in the academy very much. So then you're reporting a very biased perspective. Also, not many, or not everybody, was happy about this exploration into diversity and inclusion, as reported by one survey respondent who said that this survey is a waste of time and money, probably brought on by some do-gooder who eats tofu and does yoga. People have better things to do than looking for homophobes on every corner. What came up with the idea for this survey? The AFS is full of professionals. We should care less about someone's ethnicity or bedroom habits. Another individual stated, tell the liberals in the AFS not to worry about minorities, continue to treat everyone with respect. So while these might represent minority perspectives, and hopefully they do, they still present opposing forces to creating an equitable profession and establishing diversity and inclusion initiatives, and this is quite problematic. So after the survey, the AAFS basically sort of revised its diversity statement and presented it as an affirmative statement in its policies and procedures manual, which is really just one sentence. And then in 2018, the AAFS established the Diversity Outreach Committee, who is focused on promoting diversity within the greater AAFS. Now, while these two initiatives are quite important and quite good first steps, the ability to affect overall change within the entirety of the academy has been incredibly slow, and really is not really certain without concerted effort and support from the higher ups, as well as through the individual sections. Now, on a much more local level, the anthropology section has been a little bit ahead of the curve in this, in that we've been talking about this for some time. And finally, in 2017, established an ad hoc committee on diversity and inclusion, which became permanent in 2018. And so this is what I am co-chair of with my co-chair, Kate Bird, who is a forensic advisor and forensic anthropologist with the International Committee of the Red Cross. And so we now have 10 members, and that range from students to professionals, and in all different sectors of forensic anthropology. We advocate for diversity and inclusion. We develop many initiatives. And then also several of us, Kate Bird and I in particular, developed a demographic survey in order to see the perspective of diversity and inclusion within our field and get at some demographics. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about now. And this is, we presented on this before in the past and are now working on a publication that will hopefully be out soon. So in order to assess the demographics of diversity and inclusion in our field and to really see how diversity and inclusion are perceived, we sent out a IRB approved survey to the entirety of the anthropology section of the AAFS, which consisted of a little over 500 individuals at the time. And we had 211 individuals respond, which represents about 48% of the section, which is actually a really, really robust response rate. So that's great. But let's see, and in the initial responses, we had that 76.8% reported, self-reported themselves as women and female. And this is really in line with other studies of biological anthropology, like Trudy Turner's work, who found that really in biological anthropology in general, women and females are represented in upwards of 70%. So this is definitely consistent with that. Now, something of interest that we found is that 32.4% of the survey respondents self-identified as a member of a minority group. Now, they could write in, they could click a box that yes, they were, and then they could write in how they identified. So we didn't have pre-specified boxes. So individuals reported within that underrepresented group as LGBTQ, female, Latinx, Native American, Asian, African American, Jewish, first-generation college student, and disabled. Now, at first, 32.4% sounds like a great number and not bad compared to a lot of other organizations. But if we look kind of more specifically at ethnic diversity, only 13.3% identified as non-white. And we could see that that individuals who were sort of in the younger career tracks, or like that who just earned their BA or their bachelor's degrees and their master's degrees were more ethnically diverse than those who had their PhDs or their MD and PhDs, and those who had achieved a certification status through the American Board of Forensic Anthropology. So what we're at least anecdotally seeing is that diversity decreases with advancement. Now, these actually aren't statistically significant, but I think that is in part because non-white diversity was so low in every educational group that it was just incredibly low. So we are probably a little bit more in line with biological anthropology in general, wherein Susan Antone's work identified that about 7% of biological anthropologists are from underrepresented groups. Now, a lot of individuals, particularly those in academia, argued that, or reported that they consider, and that their universities consider diversity within the application process, and that diversity in graduate admissions was particularly important for graduates and a little bit less for undergraduates, because they're perceiving as undergraduates as already particularly diverse. But really what we found was that diversity ranked low compared to many other factors of admissions like GPA, letters of recommendation, writing sample, CV, and GRE. In fact, the GRE ranked third in importance, GPA ranked first, and diversity really ranked last. Also, there's really no guidance at our universities or places of work, but a lot of these individuals were academics. There was really no guidance in how to improve diversity. And most individuals thought that this lack of diversity was problematic in all contexts, including undergraduates, graduate students, postdoctoral, faculty, and university administration. And again, survey respondents reported that they perceived, professors reported that they perceived their undergraduates to be more diverse, and their graduate students to be less diverse, postdocs less diverse, faculty even less diverse, and university administration being even less diverse. Now, an interesting thing that we found through the survey was that quite a few individuals experienced discrimination and harassment, which was really not reflected in the 2011 survey done by the AFS. Now, the majority of people feel generally accepted at their work, in academic institutions. They feel pretty well accepted. 95% feel accepted at the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. Around 90% feel accepted within the anthropology section. But within the AAFS, 15.2% have experienced discrimination, and 39% have witnessed discrimination within the entire organization. Specifically, if we're talking about anthropologists, 24% have experienced discrimination, and 42% have witnessed discrimination. So this is a pretty big number. Now, another problematic thing that came out through the survey is that most people did not know how to report episodes of discrimination or harassment, and there's no clear mechanism in which to do so. So 33%, almost 34% didn't know how to report discrimination at the AFS, and 40% didn't know how to report it in the anthropology section. Now, if we break that down by educational level, younger individuals, it's upwards of like 60% don't know how to report, and people higher up, it's a little bit lower. But I think this is reflected nicely in this quote from someone who stated that I would not know where to start with reporting discrimination at the AFS, considering that there would be career consequences. I've been witness to some awful incidents in the past that just quietly went away because no one wanted to say something or didn't think it was a problem. I don't attend the annual AFS meetings anymore. And so discrimination and harassment do contribute to attrition. In fact, almost 7% said that they have considered not attending the annual meetings anymore because of it. And over 11% have considered leaving the field entirely because of discrimination. So it's clearly a problem. Now, when asked specifically about diversity within the AAFS and within the anthropology section, most, over half, believed that there was little diversity within the AAFS as a whole, And then 63.5% thought that there was little diversity in the anthropology section. And really, the majority of folks believe that the anthropology section can do more to increase diversity. And so this is something that we, of course, are focused on. Now, not everyone believes that addressing diversity and inclusion initiatives are fruitful endeavors. And this is reported in somebody from the 2018 survey. They said, just be welcoming. Don't point out the lack of diversity. Just be welcoming and let things happen naturally. I don't think it is good to point it out to people. We're anthropologists and we're aware. I think focusing on it can make matters worse and it alienates people. You can't force it, you can only be open to it. Now, I actually think that this is a perspective that a lot of anthropologists share, that because we are anthropologists who are interested in studying human variation and diversity of skeletons, that we will automatically become diverse, sort of tacitly speaking. But really, as this survey indicates, as much and many of our personal experiences, approaching diversity apathetically and passively does not help to promote a culture of diversity or equity, essentially. So we asked via an open-ended question what we could do to increase diversity in our field. And there were numerous things that were highlighted by individuals, including the improvement of college or university affordability, which is really out of our hands in a lot of ways, but that is of course important. Hiring diverse professors who reflect the demographics of students. Basically increasing inclusive practices at multiple different levels. And then increasing things like recruitment, participation, and retention in general. So the key things that really popped out were targeted outreach, early exposure to the field of biological and forensic anthropology, and really sincere mentorship rather than simple academic advising. So targeted outreach was something that was clearly stated by a lot of people, and most individuals said when asked who should we target, people reported people of color or all groups or LGBTQ plus individuals, and they listed many different. And only, I would say, 3 individuals said that targeted outreach shouldn't be done. But one respondent reported, people of color. I feel as though I should emphasize LGBTQ individuals since that is the underrepresented group I'm a part of, but the fact that less than 1% of anthropologists are Black to be even more alarming. The field is doing something very wrong here. We not only need scholarships, but we need to actively seek out students and tell them to apply. Go to the students, don't wait them for them to come to you. There are minority students that struggle out there, but attitudes and barriers usually have them drop out of the field before they get past undergrad. Now, so basically, as anthropologists, we can do more at both the individual and group levels. And Kate and I have sort of identified 3 major areas that we could start addressing with overcoming these issues. One of them is overcoming the effects of meritocracy. And that could be in doing things like eliminating or reducing the importance of the GRE or standardized test requirements. Now, there's been a lot of research recently that has come out about the GRE, and that its success or individual success when taking it is largely tied to race, socioeconomic status, and gender. And that it actually prevents women and underrepresented minorities from doing really well in it. And so instead of focusing on the GRE, researchers suggest that we could look at specific achievements and particularly how they would interact or how they would operate with being a graduate level researcher. And this could be done through conducting interviews, either in person or online, that ask about life experiences and pivotal moments in their life, and getting a fuller picture of the individual. Of course, we also need to realize that there are impediments and things that we need to overcome, like financial support and helping to find financial support for students, helping to point students in the right direction. There are obviously needs. Some of our students are parents. And so schools and universities need to consider things like providing childcare or access to that or help with finding that. And one of the big things that we should think about, and I think the field of science in general, is that we should really start to reconfigure definitions of success beyond publications and grants. Of course, publications and research are incredibly important in forensic anthropology, either in practice, in academia, and in many different things. But grant awards are partly related to publication status, and publication status is partly related to socioeconomic status and to ethnicity. So that is something that is problematic. and we need to address. And so from job applicants, we can ask them to explain narratives about how they are contributing to the field and how their research and experience contributes directly to diversity and inclusion. Now, another big thing that we have found with the survey and that we need to address is discrimination and harassment. Obviously, there needs to be increased transparency for reporting discrimination and harassment. And we not only need increased transparency, but the membership, particularly of the AAFS, needs to be informed of the mechanisms for reporting that, and it needs to be made clear regularly. So the Anthropology section recently, the D&I committee formed a subcommittee to address discrimination and harassment, so that it consists of anthropology members who are working to explore this and report some hopefully meaningful and actionable items to leadership. The whole organization in general, the AAFS, should also consider joining the Society's Consortium on Sexual Harassment in Science, Technology, Engineering, Mathematics, and Medicine. So this was established in 2019, and currently I think consists of over 78 scientific societies who have the goal of providing resources for academic societies and scientific societies in how to manage claims or issues of discrimination and harassment. And these individuals acknowledge that this is preventing national research efforts when discrimination and harassment are running rampant in certain fields. And again, we need to have explicit guidance and regular education on how to report episodes of discrimination and harassment, and then the clear potential outcomes. What is at stake if someone is found guilty of discrimination and harassment, rather than sweeping it under the rug or protecting the person being accused versus the victim. And so this is something that our field is currently trying to address. And of course, a major thing that we're trying to address also is overcoming exclusion. Exclusion has been part of our field for a long time. And that is in part due to sort of the historic structure of our field, where it has been controlled by just cisgendered European American males who have maybe unintentionally or intentionally in certain contexts prevented people from accessing the field. So targeted outreach is incredibly important, and this can happen through active and passive ways. One important thing that we should keep in mind is that individuals from underrepresented communities should actually be a part of the outreach process. But we could present active outreach, talk about the field of forensic and biological anthropology, career opportunities, and just the overall applications to places like historically Black colleges and universities, other minority majority schools, civic groups, community colleges, museums. A great way to do this now, I think, is through Skype a Scientist, where this is something that you can do from home, wherein you speak to a class or a home, generally of younger individuals, and in places that don't have access to science or want to demonstrate the diversity of scientists that are out there. We can also do things like passive outreach by creating educational brochures about the field, and that aren't just advocating for one academic program, but the field in general. And it's important for these academic brochures to not only highlight the cool things about our field, but also our commitment to diversity and inclusion. Now, I think some people would argue, especially in forensic anthropology, that it might be hypocritical to promote our field to younger and younger people for the fear of being unable to support them with jobs. But it's important to keep in mind that individuals with diverse perspectives and experience, when they enter our field, will think of new and novel ways in which to apply biological and forensic anthropology in ways that we haven't been thinking about. So I don't think we should be fearful of inviting more people into our field for fear of our jobs. And then one of the major components that came out of the survey and that we've all kind of known is that mentorship is a big deal. And again, above and beyond simple academic mentoring. And so the Diversity and Inclusion Committee of the American Academy of Sciences Anthropology section came up with a mentorship program and recently outlined that and put it forth. And so it's a year-long mentorship program that matches a mentee, which would be a student or a recent graduate, with a professional that could be a master's through a PhD person working in any sector of forensic anthropology. We match them based on their identity and their experiences and goals. And they have that relationship for about a year where they check in at least once a month with each other. So we're really excited about that. And this just got up and running. Another thing that we can do as academics in particular is increase training and research opportunities for undergraduates and graduate students. And this could be including undergraduates and graduates into all levels of research, from the study design formulation phase all the way through the publication phase, which could help demystify that study design to publication pathway that is so often deemed elusive and unattainable to many junior scholars. Also, fostering a collaborative approach early can really just help foster collaboration in the field in general, rather than seeing individuals in the field as competition. Another thing that we need to keep in mind is that we need to increase the diversity of educators. Of course, that's a lot easier said than done, but that we need to, that needs to be prioritized in job announcements. And in that those job announcements should not be overly specific. They should be much more generalized. And that applications should be solicited specifically from minority individuals, so targeted outreach to postdocs or people finishing their PhDs. And this, there's been research to show that that not having educators reflect the demographics of the students leads to students dropping out or leaving the field because they're not seeing themselves represented. And so this is something that we need to think about at a bigger level and university level as well. So, there's a lot to talk about and a lot to do with forensic anthropology and diversity and inclusion. And I know that these things apply to all areas of science and other fields. But some of the things that we've learned kind of thus far is that, it's kind of the inexperience leading the inexperience when you're trying to tackle diversity and inclusion initiatives, at least from my perspective, and not having training in this or experience with this, but having an intense desire to improve it. But overall, it's obviously well-intentioned. And it's a learning process, so we're learning as we go. We're also using our personal experience to guide us in a way, in seeing how we were brought up in the field, what things worked and didn't work for us, what we would like to change. And so that means that we need a multiplicity of voices. So when we are establishing these diversity committees, we want to get numerous types of diversity and different perspectives on these committees so that these multivocal arguments can be made about diversity and inclusion. And that, a lot of us are blind to other biases that we may have. So having a multiplicity of voices is incredibly important. And it's also difficult to know where to start with any of this in any field. It's totally overwhelming. But one of the first ways that you could do that is taking a survey, getting at a climate, trying to establish what the climate is in your professional organization about diversity and inclusion. And then we've been looking towards other organizations for examples and models because we are kind of late to the game. So there's been a lot of work done by other groups. So we've been borrowing great ideas and asking for help in a lot of ways, and people are more than happy to help with that. Another thing to keep in mind is that organizational change takes a lot of time. We might be having a lot of successes as anthropologists within the AAFS in moving towards diversity and inclusion initiatives, but the greater AAFS is taking much more time because not everyone sees the benefits of diversity and inclusion. And again, kind of leading to my last point, not everyone is going to be happy with D&I initiatives. There is a fear out there of reverse discrimination, a fear out there of sort of being left behind and of being replaced in certain individuals, or thinking that the field is already diverse. I've received a lot of, not a lot, but some directed opposition to diversity and inclusion initiatives from very select people in our field, but they've been vocal about it. And they've made it known that they are not happy with it. You can argue with that until your face turns blue, but there are going to be people that don't appreciate what you're doing. So with that, I will end that there. Again, I want to thank you all for attending, either synchronously or asynchronously. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me at tallman@bu.edu if you have any questions about any of the research I presented or what I'm currently working on, or just about forensic anthropology in general. Also, you can find me at Twitter, on Twitter at FabLab at BU. So thank you again for attending this, and I look forward to seeing more of these talks in the future. So thanks again to Michael for doing this. So thank you.